Welcome to our studies of the book of Ruth. And it's only a small book, there are only 4 chapters in it, but we're going to look through it and consider, as we explore it, our own relationship with God and Jesus, and hopefully it will help us to see that God is in control even in those times when we don't see it. So the question is God really in control of our lives and circumstances? Can we be certain he is involved in our lives even when they appear dark and difficult? Well, yes, comes the resounding answer from the book of Ruth. And this book is not alone in this. The assurance is there throughout Scripture. In the ups and downs of their early history, the people of Israel discover that God works on their behalf even when they endure the horrors of slavery and homelessness. Facing impossible military battles and hostile nations, they learn that God hears their cry and acts to relieve their difficulties. The setting of the book of Ruth in the context of community worship reminds us that Scripture shapes worship and must be heard in the context of praise, thanksgiving, and confession. Scripture prevents worship from being simply our private ideas about God. These ancient festivals are important reminders of God's mighty acts in time and space. This book has profound pastoral implications too. It takes us into a world of intense joy and immense grief. Ruth needs to be seen in the context of the whole Bible and not simply Old Testament theology. There are parts of the written word that point to the living word, Jesus Christ himself. I'll say that again. There are parts of the written word, the Bible, that point to the living word, Jesus Christ. As we go through the book of Ruth, we'll identify with some of Ruth and Naomi's feelings. We may even have been there ourselves, and we'll discover how they both relied on God to make good their situation and how God ultimately used them to the glory of all his people, you and me included. Individuals struggle with their faith in testing times, and yet somehow their strength and trust enable them to make powerful statements of faith. Think of many of the Psalms or the story of Job. In fact, the story of Job has many parallels with the story of Ruth. Job's family, like Naomi's, suddenly finds itself in dire circumstances. But amid those circumstances, both Job and Naomi discover a deep faith in their God. Job declares in Job chapter 19, I know that my Redeemer lives. And Naomi says to her friend in Ruth chapter 4, Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. Both stories show that we can affirm God's control and influence over our lives, even in the really difficult times. Ruth chapter 1 hints at this theme throughout. Verse 6 affirms that God provides for the physical needs of his people. I'll just read you that. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. Verses 8 and 9 bear witness to Naomi's belief that the Lord shows kindness and brings rest to his people, and that Naomi can trust her family to God's care wherever they go. But her struggle of faith is evident when she says that the bad things that have happened to her are from the Lord's hand. The fact that God is in control doesn't save us from difficulties, but it gives us hope and strength as we endure such trials. And we can find that reference to that in James chapter 1, for example. As we begin one of the Bible's most beautiful and sensitive stories, we should pause to get our bearings and ask what kind of story it is. Well, we have two clues. Firstly, it is one of the 5 scrolls sung at the great festivals of Israel. It was assigned to be read at Pentecost, along with the story of the giving of the law at Sinai. And thus, this little story becomes part of God's great story of salvation of his people. It's about how God relates to his people and how they relate to him. The second clue is in verse 1. Here it tells us it occurred when the judges ruled. It may help to set out the first 8 books of the Bible. They are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and then Ruth. Ruth being the 8th book of the Bible. So Ruth chapter 1 verse 1 tells us that all these events in Ruth happened during the time of the Judges, which is the book just preceding Ruth. The next question we have is, who wrote the book of Ruth? Do you know, there are various ideas around about this, but I think a likely time, notice I've avoided the question of who wrote the book of Ruth, but I think a likely time is during the reign of David or Solomon, when foreigners were a large part of the power base, as Ruth is a fine example of a foreigner who commits herself to Israel and to Yahweh. As I said, the book of Ruth is only 4 chapters long, but I have split it up into 6 episodes. I trust that through it we will see that the God of Israel is the God of the universe, and how the God of the universe impacts on our daily living. Thank you.